Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you a story about a new neighbor whose second name is obviously Karen. I remember the first time I set eyes on the house that would become mine. It was a modest two-story home with just enough charm to make it feel like it was meant for me. At 29, buying a house felt like a milestone, a sign that I'd finally achieved some stability in life. Little did I know, stability wasn't exactly what I was walking into. The trouble started before the papers were even signed. As I pulled up to the property one afternoon for a final walkthrough, I spotted a woman standing at the edge of the lawn. She was maybe in her early 40s, dressed in a neat blouse and slacks, with a scowl that seemed permanently etched on her face. Her arms were crossed tightly, and her gaze was fixed directly on me. "Are you the buyer?" she asked sharply. "Yes," I said cautiously, extending a polite hand. "I'm Ryan. Nice to meet you." She ignored my hand and scoffed. "Too young to own a place like this. You don't belong in this neighborhood." I was stunned but tried to stay calm. "Well, I'm looking forward to settling in," I replied, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. Her glare deepened. "We'll see about that." I brushed it off, thinking she was just having a bad day. But during the closing process, I found out she wasn't bluffing. Her name was Carrie, and not only was she my soon-to-be next-door neighbor, but she was also close friends with Neil, the real estate agent managing the sale. According to my agent, Carrie had been pressuring Neil to block the deal, insisting I wasn't suitable for the neighborhood. She'd even gone as far as offering to pay him to sabotage the sale. Fortunately, Neil had a strong preference for commission checks over Carrie's friendship, so he pushed the deal through anyway. When my agent told me this, I couldn't help but laugh. "Guess I've got a welcoming committee already," I joked. But the discount I got on the sale was no joke. Neil, trying to smooth things over, had shaved off a couple of $1,000s to make up for the drama. I accepted, thinking it was the perfect start to a new chapter in my life. Moving day came quickly and I was excited. The neighborhood was quiet and picturesque, lined with well-kept homes and manicured lawns. It felt like the perfect place to start fresh. That illusion lasted less than a week. Carrie's hostility didn't fade once the sale was final. If anything, it ramped up. She avoided direct confrontation but found plenty of passive-aggressive ways to make her disapproval known. She'd glare at me every time I stepped outside, muttering things under her breath that I couldn't quite catch. Once, I caught her standing at the edge of her yard, watching me unload groceries, shaking her head like I was committing some kind of offense. Still, I told myself it was nothing. After all, how much trouble could one neighbor really cause? As it turned out, I'd underestimated her completely. At first, Carrie's actions were more annoying than anything else. She'd let her dog roam freely across my yard, often digging up the flower beds I'd worked hard to plant. It was irritating, sure, but I convinced myself it wasn't intentional. Maybe she just wasn't paying attention to her dog. Then came the rumors. One day, while trimming the hedge along the edge of my property, a friendly neighbor named Maria stopped by to chat. She seemed nice, mid-30s, energetic, and genuinely curious about my plans for the house. As we talked, she casually mentioned something that made me freeze. "Carrie's been saying some interesting things about you," she said, lowering her voice as if she didn't want to be overheard. "What kind of things?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Maria hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "She's telling people you're reckless, that you throw loud parties and don't respect the neighborhood. Stuff like that." I blinked. "I've been here less than a month. The loudest thing I've done is run the lawnmower." Maria shrugged apologetically. "I figured it wasn't true. Just thought you should know." I thanked her and went back inside, my mind racing. The idea that someone would spread lies about me, a complete stranger, was baffling, but there was no mistaking where it was coming from. Carrie was determined to make me unwelcome. The tension only escalated from there. One morning, I found trash scattered across my lawn. It wasn't random litter, it was my trash. The bin I'd set out for pickup the night before had been tipped over and emptied. It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing scratches on my car. They weren't deep, but they were deliberate. Long, thin lines etched into the paint. At first, I thought it might have been a stray branch or a careless passerby, but the scratches always appeared overnight. Still, I didn't have any solid proof. Without cameras or witnesses, it was my word against Carrie's, and she'd never confront me directly. Instead, she stayed on the periphery, watching and waiting, her passive-aggressive campaign of intimidation continuing unabated. The final straw came late one night. I'd just gotten back from a long day at work and parked my SUV in the driveway. It was my pride and joy, a brand new vehicle I'd saved for years to buy. Exhausted, I went straight to bed, looking forward to a quiet weekend. The next morning, I stepped outside and stopped dead in my tracks. All 4 tires on my SUV were flat, not just deflated, punctured. My heart sank as I walked around the car, taking in the damage. Tiny holes had been stabbed into the sidewalls, rendering them completely unusable. It wasn't a random act of vandalism. Someone had deliberately targeted my car, and I had a pretty good idea who it was. I felt a mix of anger and helplessness. Confronting Carrie without evidence would get me nowhere, and calling the police seemed pointless without proof. I was stuck. That afternoon, as I worked on arranging replacements for the tires, I noticed my neighbor across the street, Jackson, watching from his porch. He was a quiet guy, probably mid-30s, and we'd exchanged nods a few times but never really talked. Something about his expression made me walk over. "Hey," I said, waving awkwardly. "Got a minute?" Jackson nodded, setting down the mug he was holding. "What's up?" I explained the situation, keeping it as brief as possible. As I talked, Jackson's face grew more serious. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "I've got cameras," he said simply. My eyebrows shot up. "You do?" "Yeah, hidden ones. They cover part of your driveway." He paused, studying me for a moment. "You want to check the footage?" I could have hugged him. Instead, I nodded, trying to keep my excitement in check. "That would be amazing. Thank you." A few minutes later, we were sitting in Jackson's living room, scrolling through the footage from the previous night. It didn't take long to find what we were looking for. There she was, Carrie, wearing a dark hoodie and gloves, creeping into my driveway in the dead of night. She crouched next to the tires, something sharp in her hand, and went to work. Even though she kept her head down, her face was unmistakable. "Got her," Jackson said, leaning back with a satisfied grin. I stared at the screen, a mixture of relief and anger washing over me. Finally, I had what I needed. "You okay?" Jackson asked, noticing my silence. "Better than okay," I said, my voice steady. "It's time to do something about this." Armed with the video evidence from Jackson's cameras, I knew it was time to take action. For weeks, I'd been hesitant, trying to avoid confrontation. But now I had proof. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. Carrie's actions were caught on camera, clear as day. The first thing I did was call the non-emergency police line to report the incident. I explained the situation as clearly as I could, describing the vandalism, the repeated harassment, and the evidence I had from the video footage. The officer on the other end of the line sounded understanding, taking down all the details and assuring me someone would follow up soon. True to their word, a patrol car pulled up to my house later that afternoon. 2 officers stepped out, one younger, with a no-nonsense demeanor, and the other older, with the kind of calm presence that only came from years of experience. "Mr. Ryan?" the older officer asked as they approached. "That's me," I said, shaking their hands. They asked to see the footage, so I walked them over to Jackson's house. He greeted them politely and pulled up the video, playing the clip of Carrie in action. The younger officer leaned in closer, narrowing his eyes. "That's pretty clear evidence," he said, nodding in approval. The older officer scratched his chin. "Trespassing and property damage. That's no small thing." He glanced at me. "We'll need a copy of this footage for the report. Do you have any other incidents to add?" I explained everything: the rumors, the dog, the scratches on my car, the trash strewn across my yard. While I admitted I didn't have proof for most of it, I made it clear that this wasn't an isolated event. The officers took notes, exchanged a few words with Jackson, and assured me they'd follow up. As they left, the younger officer turned back to me. "If she's been doing this for a while, it's good you're putting a stop to it now," he said. That evening, I sat in my living room feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. It felt good to know I'd finally taken a step toward ending this nightmare, but I couldn't shake the thought of what Carrie might do once she realized the police were involved. It didn't take long for her to find out. The next morning, I watched from my window as a police cruiser pulled up in front of Carrie's house. 2 officers stepped out and knocked on her door. She answered quickly, her expression shifting from surprise to anger as they began speaking. At first, she stood there with her arms crossed, shaking her head. Then, as the conversation continued, she grew more animated, her voice rising loud enough that I could hear snippets from across the street. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "He's lying. That video could be anyone." The officers stayed calm, clearly accustomed to this kind of reaction. After a few minutes, they handed her a piece of paper, a citation, I assumed, and walked back to their cruiser. Carrie stood in the doorway, fuming as they drove away. I thought that might be the end of it, but I was wrong. 2 days later, I received a call from the officer handling the case. "Mr. Ryan, we've filed charges for trespassing and property damage," he said. "She'll be summoned to court in a few weeks. In the meantime, I'd recommend keeping your distance. If anything else happens, call us right away." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. At least now the situation was in the hands of the law, but Carrie wasn't done yet. That evening, I found a note taped to my front door. It wasn't handwritten. It had been typed, probably to avoid leaving any evidence. The message was simple and direct. "You'll regret this." I folded the note carefully and placed it in a folder with all my other documentation. Photos of the punctured tires, copies of police reports, and the USB drive containing the video footage. If she wanted to keep escalating, I'd be ready. The next few weeks were tense but uneventful. Carrie kept a low profile, barely leaving her house. I assumed she was consulting a lawyer or figuring out how to defend herself in court. Meanwhile, I worked with my insurance company to get my SUV repaired and continued documenting everything. When the court date finally arrived, I felt as prepared as I could be. Jackson had agreed to testify, and the officers assured me the evidence was solid. Still, I couldn't help feeling nervous as I walked into the courtroom that morning. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. The atmosphere felt heavy, filled with the quiet shuffle of papers and the occasional murmur from the few people seated in the gallery. I took a seat at the plaintiff's table, trying to calm my nerves. This was it. The moment when all the harassment, the stress, and the damage Carrie had caused would be laid bare for everyone to see. Carrie arrived a few minutes later, flanked by a lawyer who looked as though he was trying to mask his impatience. She didn't glance my way, but her tight posture and flushed cheeks made it clear she wasn't as confident as she'd tried to appear in front of the police. The proceedings began quickly. The judge, a woman in her 50s with an air of no-nonsense efficiency, called the case to order. "Mr. Ryan, you're bringing charges of trespassing and property damage against Miss Carrie. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. Carrie's lawyer immediately tried to argue that the video evidence was inconclusive. He claimed it was grainy, that it didn't definitively show her face, and that the timing could have been manipulated. But when the video was played in court, it was clear his arguments didn't hold water. Even with the hoodie and gloves, Carrie's face was unmistakable when she glanced directly at the camera for a split second. The judge leaned forward, watching the footage intently. When it ended, she looked over at Carrie, her expression unreadable. "Miss Carrie, do you have anything to say about this evidence?" Carrie stood, her voice trembling slightly as she began to speak. "Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. I wasn't trying to damage his car. I was checking the tires because I thought they looked low. I didn't realize I was on camera." I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to scoff. Jackson, sitting in the gallery, shot me a knowing look. The judge raised an eyebrow. "You punctured all 4 tires while checking them," Carrie stammered, clearly struggling to come up with a coherent response. Her lawyer leaned over, whispering something urgently, but it didn't seem to help. Next, Jackson was called to testify. He confidently explained how his hidden cameras worked, emphasizing that they recorded continuously and couldn't be tampered with. He also described how he'd offered the footage to me after hearing about the repeated harassment. "Did you have any reason to doctor or manipulate the video?" the judge asked him. "None at all," Jackson replied firmly. "I just wanted to help a neighbor who was being targeted." When the judge called me to testify, I detailed everything, from the dog incidents to the rumors, the trash, and the scratches on my car. I explained how the tire puncturing was the final straw, and how discovering the footage had finally given me the evidence I needed to come forward. Carrie's lawyer tried to trip me up during cross-examination, suggesting I'd exaggerated the extent of the harassment, or that I'd provoked Carrie somehow. "Why would she target you specifically, Mr. Ryan?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe she thought I didn't fit her idea of who should live in the neighborhood. But the evidence speaks for itself. I didn't provoke her, and I don't think anyone deserves to be treated the way I was." When it was all over, the judge took a brief recess to review the evidence. The wait felt like an eternity, but when she returned, her decision was swift and decisive. "Miss Carrie, the evidence presented clearly shows a deliberate and malicious intent to damage Mr. Ryan's property. This behavior is not only unacceptable but also criminal. I'm sentencing you to 18 months in county jail for trespassing and property damage, along with mandatory restitution to cover the full cost of the repairs." The gavel came down and it was done. Carrie's face was a mix of shock and fury as the bailiff led her away. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. Justice had been served. Outside the courtroom, Jackson clapped me on the shoulder. "You handled that well," he said. "Couldn't have done it without your help," I replied. "Just glad it's over," he said, grinning. "Let me know if you ever need another favor." As I drove home that afternoon, I couldn't stop smiling. Carrie was finally out of my life, at least for the foreseeable future. And I'd been fully compensated for the damage she'd caused. But the story wasn't quite over yet. Carrie's sentencing felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But as much as I wanted to close that chapter of my life, the scars she left behind, both literal and metaphorical, were still fresh. It wasn't just about the SUV or the rumors. It was the feeling of being under siege in what was supposed to be my sanctuary. I couldn't shake the lingering unease, even with her gone. In the weeks following the trial, I focused on reclaiming my peace. The first order of business was fortifying my property. I installed motion-activated cameras around the perimeter of my house, making sure every angle was covered. I also added stronger locks, better lighting, and a privacy fence to keep unwanted visitors, and their dogs, off my lawn. Word of the court case spread quickly through the neighborhood. At first, I wasn't sure how people would react. Would they think I'd overreacted? Would they take Carrie's side? But the response was overwhelmingly supportive. "Good for you," Maria said one day as we chatted near the mailbox. "She's been a nightmare to everyone on this street for years. You're the first person who actually stood up to her." Others echoed her sentiment. Carrie, it seemed, had been causing trouble long before I moved in. Petty disputes over property lines, complaints about noise that didn't exist, and a general attitude of superiority that rubbed everyone the wrong way. She even tried to get me fined for having too many flowers in my front yard, an older neighbor named Ed told me, shaking his head, glad someone finally gave her what she deserved. Despite their support, I couldn't forget the people who had enabled Carrie's behavior, intentionally or not. Neil, the real estate agent, came to mind immediately. I'd heard from Maria that Carrie had tried to bribe him into blocking my purchase, and while he ultimately didn't go along with it, he hadn't exactly warned me about what I was walking into either. So I decided to pay Neil a visit. When I walked into Neil's office, he greeted me with a cautious smile. "Ryan, good to see you. How's the new place treating you?" "Better now that Carrie's out of the picture," I said bluntly, watching his face carefully. He shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, I heard about that. Tough situation." "She told me you were friends," I said, my tone even. "And that you tried to block the sale." Neil's smile faltered. "Look, Ryan, You didn't stop her either," I interrupted. "You knew what kind of person she was, and you let me walk into that blind." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. I should have said something, but I didn't think she'd go that far." "You didn't think, period," I snapped. Neil nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. "You're right. I'm sorry." I let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "I'm not asking for an apology, Neil. I'm asking for accountability. If you ever want to work in this neighborhood again, you'd better start putting your clients first." He nodded again, and I left without another word. With Carrie gone and Neil put in his place, I turned my attention to the future. I'd moved into the neighborhood hoping for a fresh start, and now it felt like I finally had the chance to make that happen. I started small, organizing a block party to get to know my neighbors better. To my surprise, nearly everyone showed up, bringing food, drinks, and stories about their time living in the area. For the first time since moving in, I felt like part of a community. Jackson, who had become something of a friend through all this, was one of the first to arrive. "So, what's next for you?" he asked as we stood near the grill. "Just focusing on making this place feel like home," I said, "and making sure no one else has to deal with another Carrie." He chuckled. "Well, you've already done a good job of that." But Carrie wasn't quite out of the picture yet. About 6 months after her sentencing, I heard through the grapevine that she was being released early for good behavior. The news didn't surprise me. She'd always been good at playing the victim when it suited her. What did surprise me was what happened when she returned to the neighborhood. Nobody wanted her back. Her house, which had once been a gathering spot for a small group of allies, now stood quiet and empty. The people who had once tolerated her antics had distanced themselves, either out of embarrassment or fear of being associated with her. When she finally moved back in, the only person she had to talk to was the mail carrier. For a while, I worried she might try to retaliate, but she didn't. Whether it was the cameras, the court case, or the sheer isolation she faced, Carrie kept her head down and avoided me entirely. One day, as I was trimming my hedges, I saw a moving truck pull up to her house. I watched from a distance as movers loaded up her belongings, one box at a time. By the end of the day, the house was empty, and Carrie was gone. "Guess she finally got the message," Jackson said when I told him the news. "Good riddance," I replied, feeling a wave of relief. With Carrie gone for good, the neighborhood transformed. The tension that had hung over it like a storm cloud disappeared, replaced by a sense of camaraderie and peace. And for the first time since moving in, I felt like I truly belonged. Reflecting on everything, I realized that standing up for myself hadn't just been about protecting my property. It had been about setting boundaries, demanding respect, and showing that bad behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Carrie might have tried to tear me down, but in the end, her actions only brought me closer to the people around me. And as I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I couldn't help but smile. This was home. Friends, thank you. See you soon.